This is the Anthrobiology Podcast, hosted by me, Gabby LaPera. Every 2 weeks, I interview a biological anthropologist about what makes us, us. Welcome back to another episode of the Anthrobiology Podcast. In this episode, I had the pleasure of interviewing Dr. Becker of UC Riverside. And in the episode, in terms of actionable advice that you'll receive, you will learn a lot about acclimating to altitude. So that is one thing you can take away with you from this episode if we ever all get to go outside again, which is actually something else I should note. During this episode, we do talk about things like going to pottery classes and doing research. Those are things that aren't happening anymore because of the coronavirus, but that's why we sound super blasé about it in this episode, is because we taped all of this back in, I want to say 2019. We had no clue what was coming. Getting back into what this show is about academically, we talk a lot about physical activity and the patterns it leaves on bones. You might actually remember me talking about this with Dr. Wilczak in the second episode. And if you haven't listened to that, I strongly encourage you to listen to that. And we also talk about Lake Titicaca, and this is actually the second time that I've talked to a researcher who has done work in this area. The other person that had a super great interview, also a bioarchaeologist, is Dr. Youngst of UNC Charlotte. One of the things that you'll hear us talk about is the deformation model for bone growth. I'm actually posting a picture of what that looks like on my website. I think it's a really useful concept to have in mind when you're thinking about bone modeling and remodeling. And yeah, what else do you need to know? Right. This was recorded via Zoom, and actually the recording got a little bit messed up in a couple of places. There's like a couple glitches. There's not much I can do about that, unfortunately. And just in case you listen all the way to the end, the last 2 minutes are pretty geeky. Like Dr. Becker and I just nerded out over Stargate SG-1. Now everyone knows. Anyway, I hope you all enjoy this episode. If you have any questions, feel free to write me. Shout out to Anto, who wrote to me via Instagram. I learned this week that apparently Instagram has several inboxes that you have to check. Like there's like one for people that you've talked to before and one for people that you haven't. So if I haven't responded to you, that was why. Yeah. Oh, and before I forget, I actually was interviewed by Dr. Michael Rivera of the Arc and Anth podcast. And you should be on the lookout for a show with your favorite biological anthropology host. I'm not going to say your favorite anthropology podcast host. There's so many of us, but there's really not too many biological anthropology hosts. And I feel pretty secure in saying that I'm probably your favorite. I hope I'm your favorite. Anyway, hope you all enjoy the show. Hello, everyone. This is Gabby LaPera, and you're listening to the Anthrobiology Podcast. Joining me via Skype today is Dr. Becker of UC Riverside. How are you?
I'm good. How are you?
I'm good. Thank you so much for taking the time to talk to me. I'm really excited to be talking to someone in my time zone.
That's great.
Yeah, normally I have to like sneak out of work and be like, okay, yeah, I'm totally just taking a long lunch break. But today I'm legitimately talking to you at a normal time. Can you tell us a little bit about who you are and what you do at UC Riverside?
Sure. I'm an assistant professor in the anthropology department at UC Riverside. I'm what's called a bioarchaeologist, which sounds kind of exactly like what it is, which is a biological anthropologist and an archaeologist kind of smooshed together. I basically end up doing a lot of work with human skeletal remains. And so it's kind of a specialty within archaeology, but it's also its own subfield within biological anthropology. So I pretty much study ancient, well, it depends on what you define as ancient, but I study skeletal remains from around AD 500 to AD 1100 in South America in a prehistoric or pre-European contact culture called the Tiwanaku.
Yeah, so you're actually the second person that I have interviewed. Listeners, if you remember Dr. Youngst from UNC Durham. No, wait, no, definitely not Durham, UNC Charlotte. She also studied a culture from near the same lake, Lake Titicaca in Bolivia. And this is a particularly interesting study group for you to look at because they have such a high elevation, which I always think is so interesting. 12,500 feet above sea level. That's kind of insane. I live in San Francisco, so I don't even know. I don't know that I can get that high here, can I?
No, I mean, I think you're closest to some of the Rocky Mountains maybe in the US, maybe up towards, I guess, maybe Mount Rainier or something. But yeah, in terms of being at an altitude or an elevation that's that high and actually having it not be completely snowy and very, very cold all the time in the US is pretty impossible.
Are there any challenges to doing, because I'm assuming you do some field research out there. Are there any challenges to doing that?
I do. I've actually spent the last couple of summers in, well, our summers there, winters in La Paz, Bolivia, so the highest world capital. And I've been working in the Lake Titicaca and the Titicaca Basin region since 2006. So at this point, and I've been going back often enough here and there that I'm mostly acclimated. I can feel it in terms of I get sometimes a little more tired than I would at sea because I also live at sea level. So it ends up being a little bit more tiring. You spend the first couple of days just kind of resting and acclimating. But for people who have never been at that altitude, you can actually potentially pass out. You can have all kinds of physical problems, but if as long as you take it easy. So normally I tell students if they're planning on coming up to that altitude to not drink any alcohol for at least the first couple of days. And if they smoke cigarettes, to try not to smoke cigarettes for the first couple of days, because your body is already handling such a low oxygen level that you can really make yourself either really, really sick, like the world's worst hangover, or potentially just really have to spend a couple days in bed and then a couple more days in bed if you go too hard at that elevation.
You know what? Perfect life advice from Dr. Becker on how to deal with altitudes. You didn't think you were going to learn that today, did you? So, talking about adaptation, one of the things that you study that I think is so interesting is that you study how human bodies adapt to different activities. And since you're a bioarchaeologist, the main portion of the body that you're studying is bones. Can you talk a little bit more about how you go about doing that?
Yeah. So I think probably what most people, when they think of the human body or they think of human bones, is I think we have this tendency to think of that plastic Halloween skeleton where everything already looks formed, it's all together, and you don't expect any changes in your bones. And I saw a pretty funny meme the other day that said something along the lines of as you grow up, you lose like 95 bones in your body. And it's kind of true because as you grow, those bones from birth that are in many different pieces, like your little growth plates, grow together and form what looks like an adult skeleton. So it turns out that as you're young and as you're growing, and even into adulthood, your body has various changes that occur as you're growing. So when you're young, one of the kind of most obvious things that can happen is if you don't get enough nutrition, it can stunt your growth. And so it can affect how tall of a person you can become.
Hmm.
But in terms of your youth, how much activity you do, how much heavy duty labor can also impact bone density in the sense of where your muscles are articulating with your bones and potentially growing bigger muscles and bigger attachment areas on
Yeah.
your
So
bones.
I'm just going to pause you for one
Hmm.
second and give like a very basic biology lesson.
Sure.
So you have your skeleton in your body, and the way that you actually move around is that your muscles are attached to your bones, and it kind of works as a lever. So the muscles pull against the bones, and the more the muscle pull on the bones, the more the bones actually get deformed. And normally, like in normal life, deformation sounds like a really bad thing, but with bones, it can actually be a good thing because when the muscle pulls on the bone, it can actually cause the bone to build up a little bit more and your bones get stronger. That's why they tell little old ladies who are at risk for osteoporosis to lift weights.
Yes, exactly. And it's also our skeletons can tell us about the life we live. And you can even look at modern kind of living people. So your or my skeleton, as a shorter woman at 5'3", my skeleton would look very different from, let's say, Arnold Schwarzenegger's skeleton, who's not only a much taller man, but a bodybuilder.
Right.
So my skeleton would tell a very different story than an Arnold Schwarzenegger skeleton.
Sure. And they can even tell you things like handedness, right? Like, am I left-handed or right-handed?
Potentially, yeah, potentially we can see if you tend to do a lot of activities with one hand over the other, we might see changes on the bone that indicate you've used, let's say, your right hand a lot more than your left.
For anyone who's never seen this, professional arm wrestlers, they are definitely someone that you would be able to tell. Highly recommend you look at a picture of some of them. In fact, I'll post them on my website. The difference between their left and right sides, depending on which is their dominant hand for wrestling, is ridiculous. They look so silly. So we talked a little bit about like the changes and how like the bone can get more robust. What are some other changes that you might see in the bones in terms of hints at activities?
So not only can we see muscles, but in the areas where our bones articulate, aka our joints, those areas, if you overuse a joint or you're moving that joint in a specific direction, you can end up getting something called osteoarthritis, which we might know somebody who's older who has it in our modern population. But we do sometimes see that in early peoples, if they've been doing certain tasks over and over, very repetitive tasks, they might actually injure the cartilage in that joint. And as the body tries to heal that area, it'll grow more bone or the bone will end up being more porous or something along those lines. And so it can eventually show all of these different skeletal changes that show repetition. For example, prior to European contact or in early European contact in places like Mexico, where they were grinding a lot of grain to make tortillas,
Mm-hmm.
they actually have these kind of marks in a lot of, especially women's elbows, from spending many, many hours pushing a very heavy stone back and forth to grind corn into corn flour.
That's so incredible.
Yes. I mean, if there's another thing called squatting facets that if you spend a lot of time squatting too, you can actually see those bone changes as well.
Yeah, and I just want to emphasize that this isn't something that you're only seeing in like pre-contact South American cultures or like ancient Neolithic burial sites. This is stuff that you see in people today. Like we were talking about the squatting facets you just mentioned. That's something that you see very commonly in certain Asian populations or Slavic populations. They also do a lot of squatting.
Yeah, I mean, you see it in many modern populations. It just all that's required is that you do the task repeatedly enough, and generally a lot of times required from a younger age. So when your bones are a little bit more malleable.
Mm-hmm. Can you tell us a little bit about the Tiwanaku and some of the activity patterns that you've seen there?
Yeah, I've been looking at this pre-European contact culture, and what I've been primarily trying to understand is in the various areas, both where they lived in the kind of the heartland of their pre-European state, because they were a very large and expansive state. What I found is that they pretty much were doing various tasks within various neighborhoods of Tiwanaku. So it was almost like there was the city of Tiwanaku, and then within there were the little various neighborhoods. And so we find that there was the one grouping of people who were likely potters or ceramicists. We find another group where maybe they were llama herders and travelers, basically traders, llameros, as we would call them. So working with the llamas and then moving goods back and forth. So we see a lot of various differences between somebody who, let's say, is a ceramicist or a potter who's staying behind, living in the city, working with clay all day long, versus somebody who's walking back and forth, let's say, between one of the colonies that might take a month to get down to that colony and then another month back up. So we're seeing various changes in the musculature and in the joints that show us, let's say, like long distance walking or long distance movements versus somebody who's staying more sedentary, but then also using their hands and their arms, working with heavy and very cold clay.
I learned a word from one of your articles that I love, which is taskscape.
Yes.
And I think that's so interesting. When I was thinking about learning about how changes in the body can tell you about patterns of activity during that person's life, I was always thinking about it on an individual level. I never really thought about what it meant on a societal level. So understanding like political and economic potentially power structures from patterns of activity that you're seeing in multiple individuals.
Yes. So I think that's probably one of the key really cool things about my research that I have found, which is that by focusing somewhat on individuals where I can look at those activity patterns and see changes, but then looking at kind of the larger comparison. So what people are doing in the city versus rural areas, what people are doing in the main heartland of this state versus those who are in colonies, I can kind of understand a little bit about political relationships and political economy that's going on. And so one of the interesting things that I found is that wherever I was comparing in this area around the Titicaca Basin and anywhere that would have been either urban or rural in that high elevation, people didn't really have any kind of significant differences in how many activities or how much labor they performed. So what that kind of told me was is that it's quite possible that everybody was kind of sharing and doing kind of reciprocal labors between various areas. So you might live in the city, but then you might go out and you might help plant potatoes for part of the year to help everybody out or help your neighbors out. And so this is actually how local Aymara people who live in that region do this kind of thing, which is prior to and even with tractors, they still will offer their labor to their neighbors for free.
So this is currently.
Yes, currently they do this. So they will do this reciprocal labor where they basically offer their labor to their neighbors, and then their neighbors kind of owe them a favor. They remember this, and so if there's something else that needs to occur, whether it's planting or harvesting, then they'll trade that back, so it kind of evens out. So this modern day reciprocal labor is common throughout the whole Andes, and so I think I have a really good example of it from this Tiwanaku society, that these people were working and laboring in the Altiplano, as we call it, this area around Lake Titicaca, the high flat plain there, with their neighbors and offering their labor back and forth so that everybody was kind of working at about the same levels. So maybe not the same exact tasks, but nobody was kind of working for the elites, let's say, or like a king or a queen or someone in charge.
So it was a very flat power structure.
Yes, correct. So and we use this term, which we all are familiar with the term hierarchy, but instead what we call this is more of a heterarchy. That it doesn't necessarily say that no one was in charge, but that the power dynamic doesn't necessarily hit a top centralized location. With South America, we tend to think of the Inca and the Inca elite, or even think of like Spanish, or maybe even in North America with the idea of colonization and the Spanish, kind of taking over and forcing indigenous people to work for them. We don't see any of that amongst the Tiwanaku. You see it in a lot of other Andean cultures, like I said, like the Inca, but even other cultures who were around at the same time as the Tiwanaku. So it's really quite rare so far. We don't see a lot of violence among the Tiwanaku, which is also really rare in the Andes. And then I think the other thing that's really interesting is that they have one of their big colonies that one of my colleague, Paul Goldstein, called the breadbasket of the Tiwanaku state, which is down in Moquegua in Peru, is this lower elevation colony where they were definitely growing corn or maize and coca leaves for transport back up to the Altiplano, back to the heartland of the city. And we don't see colonists working any harder than people up in the Altiplano. In fact, it looks like they're working less hard, that they actually have lower labor rates.
It's just so interesting. And I think that this is one of the best parts about archaeology is that you know so much about these people, and they, correct me if I'm wrong, they don't have a written history.
They do not. No. In fact, everything so far that we found in South America prior to Spanish contact is all pretextual. So we base a lot of what we understand off of talking with modern indigenous people about what they remember. And then also some of the earliest chroniclers with the Spanish, a lot of whom were actually indigenous chroniclers talking about their own lives or maybe what their parents or grandparents remembered. But again, we're getting a picture from the Inca Empire and not necessarily the Tiwanaku, who predate them by about 1,000 years.
I have always really admired archaeologists because they really have this kind of interesting blend of, I'm going to take what we know in modern times and I'm going to try and like retroactively apply it. And I'm also going to take these people who otherwise would not have a voice and present to the modern world like what their lives are like. And I think that's very admirable.
I agree. It's part archaeologist, but I mean, yeah, I mean, some of it is good storytelling, but it's good factual or good science-based storytelling that we look for modern day examples. We look for people who might live the same way. And like I said, I'm lucky that there are people who still live a very traditional lifestyle in many parts of the Altiplano, including in Bolivia. So I can kind of get an idea of from talking with them how they do things, and then how they remember parents or grandparents doing things. And in fact, that's my current project. Is I've been working with modern Aymara people on stories for they remember things that they remember from being younger, and how they do various types of activity that are what we would call traditional. So people in the Altiplano still make ceramics for use, for cooking, for serving. People still weave and spin. People still weave tortora reeds. So around Lake Titicaca, they grow these reeds. And so they can make everything from little touristy llamas out of them to sell, but they actually can make huge boats that would have been what they used in prehistory to get across the lake potentially.
That's amazing. And
I think my work is cool and fun, but what they do is actually very amazing.
my follow-up question to this is, have you tried any of these activities yourself?
I have. I've grown up doing European style loom weaving. So I understand how it functions. And so I have sat with weavers doing traditional Indian weaving, which is very different from European style that has all this mechanisms involved, whereas most Indian women can kind of pull out a couple of sticks and tie some things off here and there to the ground and just weave kind of wherever they're at practically. And full kudos, I've tried it. I am not very good at it. Like I'm much better on the mechanized kind of that there's like rigorous kind of steps. And I'm sure that, and the women have told me too that, like I could learn it, that it's not that they've taught many people. Same thing with they use a drop spindle still. And we have definite evidence that they were doing that prior to European contact. We find them in burials, these little round discs with a hole in the middle that they would have stuck like a stick in the middle and done these basically woven llama or alpaca wool. And we find those in burials and in various contexts archaeologically, but I am also very terrible at that too. I just don't have the patience for it, or if it's just like mechanically, I'm just not there yet. But I get laughed at a lot, which is perfectly acceptable. I think if you're going to do any kind of anthropology, you just have to accept that you are going to be laughed at more than once during your field work.
I have to admit that I recently started taking a pottery class, and now literally every single piece of ceramic that I pick up, I look at it and I'm like, how were you made?
No, I actually have worked with this last summer when I was in La Paz. I worked with a couple of ceramicists, and one who did kind of smaller model making, little figurines, which I don't know that that would have been as common, maybe a little bit here and there in Tiwanaku culture, but definitely working with one of these women making ceramics, making pots. It was amazingly fast, and they don't use any kind of. They still don't in her community use any kind of mechanized wheel for making the pottery. She actually brings in kind of a flat ceramic or a kind of a rounded ceramic disc that she pretty much spins on the ground like a top. So when she's making it, she just spins it and then has tools that to smooth it out, a couple of pieces of soft leather and a couple of other pieces of broken ceramic to help like scrape and do that. And I think she made 2 or 3 pots within 2 or 3 hours.
That's crazy. I mean,
Yeah,
that's
no,
insane.
she's considered I mean, I asked her if she felt like she was an expert, and she was kind of like, well, maybe. She didn't want to like I guess talk up her skills, but I would consider her very much an expert. That she was very fast, and in fact, she actually made handles for the pots and told me, "Oh, well, these are the handles that we make here in Bolivia." And then she did another set of handles, and she was like, "Oh, these are Peruvian handles from the other side of the lake." So she knew various styles. And she also had her own markings for rim and said pretty much she can recognize her own pot. Like if she sold them to someone and then saw them somewhere else, she'd know that was her handiwork.
That's insane. I am so bad at pottery, like so bad. Bless you, Ian from Clay by the Bay, for putting up with me every week. Okay, so I do have a couple of other questions because understanding patterns of activity is going to be super interesting. And I think that this is also a theme that we've been seeing throughout the show, which is you're looking at all these individuals, you're looking at multiple individuals, How comfortable are you looking at these individuals and then extrapolating to saying this is what the society as a whole was like?
I'd say when I first started working, I was very cautious, but I want to say at this point in time, I'm many years out from defending my dissertation, and I've been working in Bolivia since 2006. So, more than a decade. And also, I've spent my last 2 summers talking with modern Aymara people about what they do and how they see their work and how they perform their work. And so I feel pretty confident in my own research and talking about what I'm seeing from these population levels, what I'm seeing from activity.
I don't know what your sample sizes look like. I can't remember off the top of my head, but this is kind of like a recurring theme that we've heard from a lot of anthropologists, which is we have sample sizes of varying sizes, right? So obviously the paleoanthropologists are like, I have a sample size of 1. We don't really know anything.
Yeah.
And then on the other end of the spectrum, I talked to a zooarchaeologist who's like, my sample size is literally thousands. So for you, like, what does your sample size look like and how does that feel in terms of getting to the conclusions that you're getting?
So my sample sizes, I've looked at around 2,500 people.
Holy crap. That's a lot of
Yeah,
people.
yeah. So there's good preservation of human skeletal remains up in the Altiplano, but there is amazing preservation where I work in Moquegua, Peru. It's the northern part of the driest desert in the world, the Atacama Desert. And so we pull out everything from fully mummified people and like llamas to skeletal remains. And so one of the cemeteries I work with that makes up a very large segment of the population I've studied is the agricultural population, and that cemetery still has not been fully excavated, and there's still more people at the museum that I work in Museo Concisuyo in Moquegua that I still haven't even looked at from Tiwanaku because there's just so many.
That's literally insane. Like, listeners, I cannot emphasize to you enough how insane that sample size is. I mean, like you heard us talking to Bernard Wood and Scott Williams. They're really working with 1 or 2 individuals. So to have 2,500 is insane. And I think the other thing I noticed when I was looking through your articles, I was like, this lady, she has finger bones and like
Yes.
calcanei and like all these like tiny little bones, which is not common.
No. One of the interesting things about my research that makes activity patterns sometimes have a hard sell because people are trying to fit activities to what they think the activity should be on the bones. And I have the opposite, which is I have pretty much every single bone in the body that as people were buried, we pull out everything. I've pulled out in young children ear ossicles, which is like an almost never find. Like your little inner ear bones sometimes come out with excavation. They don't tell us anything about the activity, but but we find near perfect preservation.
I'm like freaking out. That's insane. I had no idea. That is so cool.
Yeah, no, it's amazing. It is really amazing. And then in addition to looking at all of those people, then what I did was I collected, I think it's 37 or 38 different muscle attachment points. And then I collected initially for my dissertation the major joints of the body, like your knees, your hips, your shoulder joints, ankles, things like that. But I collected each individual joint surface for whether I saw evidence of osteoarthritis. And I've since gone back and looked at all of the wrist bones in your wrist, each little carpal bone. I've looked at all the fingers. I've looked at all the toes and so I have millions of data points. Yeah, not to show off or anything, but I have.
I mean, show off, like that's incredible. That's so much work and also what like a trove of information. But it does bring me to my next question, which is about statistics. And this is something I wanted to talk to you about because I saw a lot of statistics in your papers. And I remember when I went to grad school, there were so many people in my program who were like, ugh, why do we have to learn math and anthropology? Why do we have to learn math and anthropology? I think you're the perfect person to answer this.
Well, I will tell you straight up that I had help with my statistics as a grad student. Luckily, we had a social sciences institute. So I went to someone and said, here's what I'm looking to do, and here are the questions I'm kind of trying to answer. So can you help me as a statistician interpret my social science data? So I definitely had help. While I have a sister who is a math teacher, she definitely wins any kind of mathematical argument. But but I think that that in terms of what the kinds of questions we're trying to answer from our research, you can't always just look at an individual and get those answers. And especially when you're trying to look at people in the past and a population, you need to have your data calculated in a way that can make it manageable and make it understandable. So sometimes raw percentages can do some of that, but a lot of times what you need are actually pretty complex statistics, pretty comprehensive statistics, I guess, to be able to explain what you're looking at and what it might be telling you.
Right. And to actually identify patterns.
Yes.
And this is me kind of getting on my little soapbox talking to any future anthropologists that might be listening. Study math. It's fun. I promise you. The more you do it, the more fun it gets. It's going to help you out in the long run.
Yes. In fact, I have grad students that they are required to take, like, let's say, a year's worth of methods courses, and I make my bioanth grad students take statistics.
Yeah, I have to say, I'm obviously no longer in anthropology. Well, perhaps not obviously to anyone listening to this. I'm not in anthropology anymore. And one of the reasons I was able to get hired so quickly outside of grad school was because of my math background. So I was able to go into all this work and be able to do math. And people were like, wow, you know what you're doing. It's amazing. You just tell anyone that something's not normally distributed and they shake and they just say, take it away from me. You just do it. It's amazing.
Yes. Yes. Science and math terror is real for people. But for the most part, what I find awesome kind of about statistics is it really does help you answer real world questions. And it doesn't necessarily always take super complex statistics to be able to just say, okay, well, I want to kind of understand this about this culture. And so there's so many cool things with statistics that you can do with it that is predictive potentially in various circumstances, or even like being able to lump things together and find patterns that you would never have found from your own kind of visual searching as a human being.
Yeah, it's really cool stuff. Math is fun. So is science.
Not where I thought this was going to go into math, but sure. I do a lot of biomechanics now too. So I'm using a lot of kind of math there as well.
Okay, so it's time for me to ask you 3 questions. My first question, as always, is if someone wants to learn more about what you do, what's a good book or article or movie, I guess, for them to start?
So I'm sure there's lots of really interesting articles, but I think the one kind of book that solidified me looking at activity and trying to understand it and then understanding the pitfalls with it was a book called Stories from the Skeleton by another biological anthropologist named Robert Germain.
Okay.
So he presents a very cautionary tale about looking at understanding human skeletal remains and activity patterns from them, but it's an interesting place to start. So it dates to about 1999, so it's out of date at this point in time, but I think it's accessible to someone who might want to go read up on this.
Okay. And what are you reading for work right now?
I am just starting a book that I might be using in my class that I teach in the spring quarter called The Chumash World at European Contact. It's a total left turn here, but I'm trying to find a good book for my students in a class called Biological Approaches to Medical Anthropology that is something that talks about health and prior to European contact, or maybe even at the time of European contact in the Americas. I've been using a book called Disease and Discrimination from my former advisor, Dale Hutchinson at UNC Chapel Hill. But I find that teaching in California, a lot of my students don't really understand how the East Coast is set up and divided, and heck, potentially like where exactly North Carolina is, since the book is focused around that. I mean, they know where it is on a map, but like the idea of like humidity and mugginess during the summer is like a very foreign concept. So the book talks about things like malaria, and students are like, what? Like mosquitoes? So I'm trying to find something that's maybe a little bit more culturally relevant to my California students.
I have to say, I'm also from the East Coast. I'm from Virginia, and moving out to San Francisco has been hilarious. Sometimes the bark closes down because they're like, it's raining too hard. I'm like, it's just water from the sky. You're fine.
Yes, exactly. And I mean, after living in North Carolina for 10 years for doing my PhD, and living there, basically, they have snowpocalypse where they get a quarter of an inch of snow and everything must shut down. But I'm a Midwesterner by origin, so the idea of a quarter inch of snow and things closing down is like, really? So, but yeah, I mean, California has the same quality with rain, so it's all relative with the weather.
For sure. Okay, so last recommendation. What are you consuming for fun?
So I read a lot of science fiction and fantasy. I tend towards more of the fantasy, not so much like dragons and such along those lines, but I kind of nerd out on archaeological kind of focused fantasy books. And so there is Jack McDevitt, and he writes a whole bunch of different series of books. And probably the one I just reread of his was a book called Eternity Road. And it's set in our North American future after potentially some kind of a disease outbreak or civilization has collapsed. And so they call our civilization the road makers and have this whole adventure because printed books are rare in this, future 2,000 years, let's say, in the future. And so I find this, as someone who studies past cultures, absolutely fascinating that he's able to take that perspective and think about what it might be like 2,000 years in the future post the collapse of our civilization. He also does a whole really cool series of books with actually a female lead who, her name is Priscilla Hutchins. She goes by Hutch, and she's a interstellar pilot, and she works for the future of what I would hope, which is they do interstellar archaeology.
I did not even think about this being a subgenre. I am so excited to read this now.
I highly recommend him. His female characters are to me well-rounded, and the fact that he has a main female character who's the pilot. She's not necessarily an archaeologist, but she knows the archaeologists. I don't remember if he's got 4 or 5 books in this series with her, but just it's so interesting to think about the idea that we eventually hit a place where we can go do archaeology on other planets to understand how other civilizations where we have absolutely no context potentially lived, thrived, and then died off.
Okay, I'm going to show my true nerd. In Stargate SG-1, one of the main characters is an archaeologist, and someone was complaining to me about how unrealistic that was the other day, and I'm like, no, super realistic.
No, in fact, what in the movie he was speaking basically whatever the hieroglyphic language or something along those lines, and that somebody said that it was actually that he might have actually been really doing that for the movie. Oh, what's his name? He was that 80s he was an 80s heartthrob. And
Richard Dean Anderson?
No. Oh, you're talking TV show?
Oh yeah, I was talking the TV show, not the movie.
The original movie is...
Oh, I know what you're talking about.
The guy from Blacklist. I can't remember his name. God, I'm terrible with names.
Yeah, I know exactly who you're talking about.
Yeah, he plays the archaeologist in that.
What a great series.
Yes. If you grew up with MacGyver, so that's the other,
I totally grew up with MacGyver. I love Richard Dean Anderson. He was my first celebrity crush. As usual, folks, I will put up these recommendations on the website once this episode goes live. I want to thank you very much for joining me today and giving me your very precious time. I really appreciate it.
No problem. Thank you for having me. I hope to inspire some readers out there.
Perfect. Well, thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thanks for joining me for this episode of the Anthrobiology Podcast. If you have questions or comments, you can reach me at gabby.lapera@anthrobiology.com. That's spelled GABY.LAPERA@anthrobiology.com. This show is produced by me. Music courtesy of Chad Crouch, aka Poddington Bear at Sound of Picture.